Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural Roundtable for the Latin American Studies Visual Culture section. We should make a toast. We're very happy to be able to start off our first official events here at LASA 2014 in Chicago. The section has been in existence for a year now, and last year, as we began concretizing this place for an interdisciplinary discussion and engagement with Latin American visual culture studies, the section membership decided that the best way to start out would be with a pair of roundtable sessions devoted to the broader question of what exactly is Latin American visual culture and visual culture studies. As a result, we've organized two roundtables that are happening now and then immediately following. The first one devoted to broader historical issues featuring three eminent art historians who I'll introduce in just a second. And the second, which begins at 2 o'clock in this room, looking at a broader contemporary understanding of Latin American visual culture studies. I have the pleasure, I should announce myself. I should introduce myself rather. I am Ernie Capello. I am an associate professor of Latin American history at Macalester College and current chair of the Latin American Visual Culture Studies section. I have the pleasure to introduce our three featured speakers for today, who are Magali Carrera, Carolyn, and Dana Leibsohn. Magali Carrera, as many of you know, is the Chancellor Professor of Art History at the University of Massachusetts-Dartmonth. She received her BA in Art History from Arizona State University and her MA, Master of Philosophy and PhD from Columbia. She is the author of numerous publications on the visual culture of Mexico with an emphasis on the 18th and 19th centuries, including her book on the visual culture of 18th century Mexico titled Imagining Identity in New Spain, Race Lineage and the Colonial Body in Portraiture and Costa Paintings, published with the University of Texas Press in 2003, which also received the 2004 CAA Association for Latin American Art Book Award. More recently, she's been working extensively on maps and their relationship to nation-building discourses in late 18th and 19th century Mexico, which culminated in her book, Traveling from New Spain to Mexico, Mapping Practices of 19th Century Mexico, published by Duke in 2011. Carolyn Dean is professor in cultural histories of the Native Americans and colonial Latin America at the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She received her BA in Art and Art History from the University of Puget Sound and her MA and PhD in Art History from UCLA. She has published extensively on colonial Latin American visual culture, as the author of 3 books and scores of articles concerning various topics in this field. And everybody should think that they should turn off their cell phones. So I will actually model that right now. My apologies, my classes would be appalled. In any case, she is the author of several books and scores of articles, beginning with Inca Bodies and the Body of Christ, Corpus Christi in Colonial Cusco, Peru, published by Duke in 1999, and later appearing in a Spanish translation published by Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos in the Bajo Santander in Lima. Most recently, her books has included A Culture of Stone, Inca Perspectives on Rock, published by Duke, as well as scores of articles on everything from militaristic theater to well, basically everything writing on. Dana Leibsohn is the Priscilla Payne Vanderpoel, is that right? Professor of Art at Smith College. She earned her BA from Bryn Mawr with a major in anthropology, and then shifted to art history for her MA, which she did at the University of Colorado, and her PhD at UCLA. Her research addresses both indigenous visual culture and colonial Latin American trans-Pacific trade in the early modern period, and she's published on indigenous maps, manuscripts, hybridity in colonial visual culture, and trade between China and Mexico. She's held individual and collaborative fellowships from the ACLS, the Mellon Foundation, and the NEH, and has recently been active in pioneering digital humanities projects related to colonial Latin American visual culture, including serving as the faculty director of the 5 Colleges Digital Humanities Project and developing a multimedia project with Barbara Mundy titled Vistas, Visual Culture in Spanish America, 1520 to 1820. She's also a member of various editorial boards, including the Article Bulletin and the interdisciplinary journal Colonial Latin American Review. Having introduced our 3 fabulous scholars, I am going to open up the floor to them to begin discussing this broader question of what is Latin American visual culture. They're each going to give some general remarks, and then we'll have a chance for a broader conversation, including you guys as well as those of us up here at the front. Carolyn Dean was going to start, followed by Magali, and then Dana.
I'm sorry, if everyone speak up, please.
Yeah. There's no
There's no microphone.
microphone.
I was going to bend it towards me, but that would be futile. Okay. Voy a comenzar con un resumen de mi papel. Me interesa el concepto de visualidad, la manera en que se entienden o se interpreten, la manera, las cosas visuales, las cosas visuales. Claro, hay muchas maneras de ver. Hay visualidades étnicas, de género, de clase, etc. Hoy charlo de canastas indígenas de California. En la actualidad, como en el pasado, la mujer que hace la canasta, su habilidad o su saber es visible, es perceptible en la canasta, en sus aspectos técnicos. La canasta existe como una extensión de la mujer y tiene la canasta una existencia social. Entonces, cuando hablamos o cuando escribimos de canastas como objetos estéticos, sin referencia a la mujer que vive todavía en la canasta, empleamos o evocamos una visualidad colonista. Lo que aprendemos entonces es que debemos tener cuidado y recordar que hay visualidades distintas y es importante guardar la pluralidad. Entonces, keeping it plural. As an art historian, I have been using the term visual culture since the 90s. Among the consequences of the turn to visual culture is its invitation to consider not only a wide range of things than is generally categorized as art and the concomitant lack of object hierarchies, but also the concept of visuality. That is to say, the unique ways particular societies interpret visual information. While the phrase colonial Latin America brings to mind an identifiable time period and geographical scope, it was culturally diverse, incorporating many distinct visualities. To demonstrate the ways keeping visualities plural affects scholarly interpretation, I will go to the margins of colonial Latin America, to California, and to a category of object that does not spring readily to mind when the topic of Spanish viceregal art is broached. Throughout what is today California, indigenous women produced baskets long admired for their fine technique. They coiled and wove baskets for all manner of uses, from collecting and cooking to display. In a basket, the facturing process, typically consisting of twining and coiling, is visible in the end product. A mistake in weaving or stitching is readily discernible, and uneven tension results in asymmetry. There is no disguising a misstep. A basket with woven decoration in which a design element is introduced but not completed for many, usually hundreds, of subsequent discrete steps bespeaks its creator's ability to foresee the consequences of her actions, to complete complex tasks, and to manage relationships between disparate parts. According to contemporary basket makers, one must not only have in mind at the outset precisely how the finished basket will look, but also preserve this mental conception over the several months or years that may be required to finish a truly superb and complex basket. A completed basket, then, traces the movements and actions of the hands that made it. It bears witness in its structure to the creator's abilities to pay focused attention to detail, exhibit great patience, maintain balance, and create symmetry. These are characteristics of high value to indigenous California women historically. Females, as keepers of the home and caretakers of its inhabitants, were expected to maintain social relationships, to establish and nurture a network of family, friends, and trading partners who could be called upon in times of need. Women typically did not illustrate their activities pictorially, on the sides of baskets. Rather, they instantiated their abilities in willow rods, bulrush root, and sedge. A finely made, symmetrical basket was the manifestation of female gender roles. Baskets indexed to women's knowledge of the natural environment, where to obtain needed materials, and when they would be available for harvesting, as well as more subtle, highly valued characteristics such as patience, dexterity, forethought, and the ability to predict distant consequences of present actions. The medium, then, is a potent vehicle for the construction of meaning. Baskets are inherently reflexive, referring back to their own facture, which is to point inevitably to their maker. The maker herself, then, stands between the viewer and the basket, between the basket and its meaning, transforming the basket into a sign of her presence, not just her physical existence, but her character, inflecting the way the basket is perceived. Among Pomoan peoples of Northern California, women learned to weave baskets as young girls. Designs were customarily passed from mother to daughter and stayed within a matrilineage. While some design elements were labeled descriptively, turtle, mountains, waves, and so on, based on slight resemblance to things in the world, their primary function was not to be representational. Rather, the designs are relational, drawing attention to the symmetry of the patterns and the contrasts between differently colored areas. By the time women achieved adulthood, they were well prepared to enter into expected roles as wives and mothers, while maintaining their roles as daughters and sisters. For Pomoans and other indigenous Californians, the making and giving of baskets marked women's work and women's lives. Gift baskets, in particular, were the visible traces of social relationships in the Pomoan world. Generally, they were given by women to other women on special occasions, first menstruation, marriage, childbirth, and so on. Often adorned with woodpecker, quail, and duck feathers, and shell beads and pendants, or other materials that would prohibit practical use, gift baskets were in general not designed to be used for anything other than display. Typically, gift baskets were suspended so that they occupied aerial spaces like the birds from which the feathers were taken. The feathers would quiver in the breeze, and shell beads and pendants, as well as iridescent feathers, such as those from the male mallard duck, would catch and reflect the light. Because there is no image, the pressure to focus on the materials and their qualities, and on the basket maker and her qualities, is intensified. As assemblages of gathered materials, Pomoan gift baskets exhibit the basket maker's finest work, her skills. According to custom, they were only made when the woman was happy, and so they were invested with the best of who she was in her world. Ideally, at her death, the baskets were returned to her and burned with her body on the funeral pyre, along with her own baskets and other belongings. In this giving and giving back, we can understand Pomoan gift baskets as extensions of the basket maker herself, as distinct bodies created by her, but existing only because of her. Because every woman who owned a basket knew the woman who made the baskets were themselves social beings. Through the weaving process, the basket was invested with the maker's essence and her attributes, and it remained linked to her even when given away. Thus, it was not intended to exist on this earth without her. It did not just embody her, it was her body, certainly metaphorical, but also metonymical, and so it died with her, burning along with her flesh. The burning of the corpse was contrary to Catholic practice. When evangelizing friars converted the Pomo and other California natives to Catholicism, they introduced and insisted on burial. Initially, baskets were buried with their makers. While not against Christian teaching per se, the purposeful waste of a perfectly good basket was inconsistent with European practices, and so it was discouraged. Spaniards and others, such as Russians and later Euro-Americans, who also came into contact with Pomoan groups, readily recognized the craft value of the baskets. The first Spaniards to enter California identified baskets made throughout the region as desirable and collectible. Although basket collection reached its zenith only after the area had passed from Spanish and then Mexican hands, the story of California baskets and their makers is an important one because its roots go back to the colonial period when, in Spanish hands, the social being of baskets was first obscured. The notion of visuality urges us to acknowledge diverse perspectives and the implications of those perspectives. Non-Indigenous observers, from Franciscans to modern museum-goers, operating out of their own visualities, could not see what natives saw. They could not see the woman entwined in the fibers of her baskets. The challenge for those who labor to understand Indigenous creations in colonial Latin America and later is to find ways to speak of Indigenous things without centering the European episteme, to resist colonialist interpretations of visual culture. Indeed, there is good reason to think that Pomoan baskets continue to function for Native peoples as social bodies, entangling non-Native collectors in Indigenous ontologies, even as Native peoples were introduced to European and Christian worlds. In the late 20th century, Pomoan basket makers, including Elsie Allen, seen here, have been invited to review museum collections. Often they have been able to identify particular hands. Thus do we learn that the woman is still in her basket. In a recent exhibition of native baskets at Yosemite National Park, basket maker Julia Parker observed, and I quote, "When people look at baskets, they're looking at it as a basket, but not really understanding what a basket is about." So to be clear, the challenge is ours to envision the maker in her creation. Even if we cannot always name her, we can know that she is there, contained in its coils, stitched into its fibers. The shift in perception, in visuality, is ours to make. That Pomo baskets continued to signify along Indigenous lines even after a century of domination by non-Native peoples is evident in the common naming practice of Pomoan children, Cullen, after Stuart Cullen, who collected many baskets for the Brooklyn Museum in the early 20th century. Through Indigenous naming practices, Cullen was himself entwined into the network of Pomoan kinship, stitched into its coils, if you will. The baskets he collected then were not removed from Indigenous networks, but rather they remain extensions of it, marking his social exchanges. Elsewhere, and from an earlier period in California, we have chumash baskets, such as this one, woven with motifs derived from Spanish coins, which featured the coats of arms of Castile and Leon, crowned and flanked by the Pillars of Hercules. This basket was created in the early 19th century by a chumash basket maker named Maria Marta from Mission San Buenaventura. She identifies herself in the rim inscription. One avenue of interpretation leads us to discuss such baskets as evidence of the impact that Spanish imagery had on the chumash, of the copying of European motifs and the inspiration European pictures provided Native artists. Lillian Smith, who is most responsible for bringing attention to baskets of this type, concluded that they must have been commissioned by Spaniards who specifically requested the coin motif. And that is certainly possible. Another avenue, equally available to us, but curiously one never taken, is to recognize that where once women gave baskets, knowing they would, in the course of time and in the development of a relationship, receive a basket in return, in the new world of the mission, coins might be exchanged for baskets. Integrating the coin into the basket by means of its imagery was to acknowledge the relationship between baskets and coins. It converted the monetary unit into recognizable Indigenous currency, basket currency, giving it Indigenous social value. Moreover, it invested the coin with a social presence. To push a bit further, we might understand the inscription of Maria Marta's name not just as the adoption by an Indian woman of the European practice of artists signing their names to the work, but rather, or also, as an effort to ensure that Maria would stay in the basket long after it left her hands and traveled beyond her set of immediate social relationships. Indeed, this basket made its way to Mexico City, where in the early 20th century it was discovered in the shop of an antiquities dealer by none other than the pre-Columbianist Zelia Nuttall. Because baskets, especially those that are well made, were intended for display, museum exhibition is not so very different from pre-contact contexts. What has changed most significantly is not the maker nor the basket, it is the viewer. The opportunity of visual studies in Latin America is to explore the multiple visualities that once invested meanings into those things we now behold. And this would extend beyond the simple dichotomy of Indian and European to consider gendered, ethnic, and class visualities as well. So one of the challenges of visual culture in Latin America is to recognize how our own visualities reflect what and how we see. We cannot see the woman in the basket until we acknowledge that she is there. Beyond that, now that we know she's there, the pressing question is, how will we respond to her?
Yes, please. Don't you want your chair?
Oh, I did. I like this chair.
Well, good afternoon, and I think I want to thank Ernie for bringing us together, because when you start the term visual culture, you go, oh my God, this is a huge topic, and how do we begin to figure out what are some of the challenges and issues we want to raise. Think about visual culture theory, visual culture in material culture, to the history of visual culture, scopic regimes, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this has been swirling around in my head for the last week as I've tried to figure out how to pull something that really looks at very broad issues, challenges that we might want to think about as we continue our conversation. So, 3 topics: genealogy, intentionality, and circulation, and I think I'll have time to talk about writing, how we write this. So, most simplistically and broadly, visual culture is about looking. And visual culture is about looking and how that looking becomes embedded in systems of circulation and exchange. How someone takes that looking, categorizes it, names it, then often produces it in some material form, perhaps an image, a built space, even a sound or a taste as well. Once produced, the material form can be reproduced and then often can be reproduced and circulated. And all of this is accomplished through the prisms of one's view of the world and intention within that world. All of this, looking, naming, production, reproduction, circulation, is a kind of visual loop. And we, as researchers and scholarly writers, enter this loop discourse, this looped discourse, again, through very specific prisms. Now I want to give you sort of an example of some of how this can work in all of its overlapping perspectives. But first, I want to talk a little bit, before I get here, about genealogy. Now, art history, we have to really think about where the remnants or aspects of art history intersect with the notion of visual culture. Art history has, in it historically, if you look back, it's been based in stylistic analysis, iconographic analysis, that really leads to a question, well, what does it mean? What does it signify in more recent years? And this has really been based, as you all know, within Western culture perspectives, and the question really would come down to, well, what does the object mean in this culture? When we begin to try that methodology, with other cultures like Oceania, Africa, and Latin America, which I have, particularly pre-Columbian. The style ideas can work, but more importantly, iconography often falls apart because iconography, while you can pick out pieces and parts of it, but iconography is not a critical idea that a traditional artist would always be focusing on, because they want to know, well, what does the object do? So, for example, Fetish, I looked at Fetish in Africa, and how these things and how these objects are really about, it's not about how they last or what they mean, but what they do for healing and other sorts of things. So we have to think about how art history sometimes will have this tension with the larger concept of visual culture as it is evolving, and I do think it is evolving. Okay, so genealogy, let's think a little bit about that. Next, intentionality and circulation. I want to think about landscape, and because I've been working in Mexico in the 19th century lately, I just, of course, brought in my favorite person right now, Antonio Garcia Cubas. The enduring physicality and physical materiality of all landscapes is often described through studies of topography or physical geography or the natural history of flora and fauna. For those who inhabit this materiality, however, the physical environment is not enduring but mutable. Here, a landscape is constantly transformed through text and images that narrate the conditions and subjective envisioning of the lived experience of looking at the land. Between 1870 and 1890, Antonio Garcia Cubas, an important 19th century cartographer and geographer, as well as Jose Maria Velasco, contemporary of Garcia Cubas and a highly lauded painter, authored through images and words distinct visual discourses on Mexico's physical environment. Mapping the nation from 1850s to the 20th century, Garcia Cubas would write the text of the Album de Ferrocarril, which you see here, and I'll talk about a little bit more in detail. Throughout this highly illustrated book, he considers the Mexican landscape through detailed descriptions of physical geography and topography, but that, while often picturesque, are guided within ideas of economic expansion. During the same period, Velasco produced magnificent panoramic paintings of Mexico. In contrast to Garcia Cubas's description, Velasco's paintings are often talked about as being narrating lived grandeur and monumentality of Mexico's physical environment. Garcia Cubas's countryside teeming with economic potential and Velasco's splendiferous panoramic landscapes. The album would be printed and circulated widely. Velasco's one-of-a-kind productions would circulate through diverse exhibitions. So, begin with the album. The construction of the Mexican Railroad, just a bit of history, was a story of 36 years of stops and starts during the first decades of Mexico's independence. 1837 marks the first railroad concession and contracts for railroad promoters, and by 1858 the trains were running from the port of Veracruz to San Juan River in central Veracruz about 4 times a week. When Maximilian entered Mexico in 1864 as emperor during the French intervention, the railroad was open for only about 70 miles. In January of 1865, Maximilian recognized the Imperial Mexican Railway Company, and the French army signed a contract to extend the Veracruz lines. Now, January 1st, 1873 marked the inauguration of the new railroad and brought much rejoicing. Antonio Garcia Cubas was part of this rejoicing, and he developed this album, which was translated into English as well. This consists of a collection of prints created by Casimiro Castro, an artist, lithographer, and draftsman, and was converted into 25 chromolith plates. The text was written by Garcia Cubas and translated into English. It's about 14 by 20 inches. What you see here then are his cover, which is a leather cover embossed with gold and black. And then you see his frontispiece, and then you also have his just some sample pages. And I'm not going to go take you through all of them. Let's So this is in the back part of the book. It was probably added later. It's not part of the original piece because there were like three editions, I think, of these. And this is open out, and it just shows you you can't see it in this slide, but there's a little red line in there that takes you from the coast to Mexico City. The plates are stunningly beautiful, not in these slides, but they are stunningly beautiful when you do look at the originals and these rich chromoliths, and you see two examples of these pages. I want to take you quickly to one of the sections where he spends where Garcia Cubas spends quite a bit of time of talking about it, and this is this one section that goes over the Metlaca. Just went down the wrong direction here. The Barranca de Metlac. And what we see here you see the actual bridge for the railroad going across with this huge structure with all kinds of steel, etc. work. And then in the second plate, you see the actual railroad trains, and you have the people just turning the corner. And so what you see here is what becomes really important is the text that Garcia Cubas attaches to this. He writes things like, slowly the dawn dissipates, in the last shadows of night, the trees commence to exhibit their different forms and the bottom, at the bottom of the ravine. And he ends this whole discourse by talking about the railroad is the mightiest artery of our social being, and being ramified through the whole of the republic will diffuse the fruitful seeds of national prosperity. Now, when you turn to Velasco, he paints these magnificent landscapes. Not in this example. This slide is kind of washed out. You see Metlaca again with the same curve in the road, but his discussion of it is really quite different. The landscape does not become as imperative. It's more imperative than the actual railroad. So, and you see this comparison of this as well. So what do we think then? Well, we see that these two, here you see another part of them, that with Garcia Cubas, you really have an attempt to look at landscape and how it's embedded in this economic expansion expected by the railroad, and how he uses these images to do these very long descriptions about all aspects of the landscape. And in contrast, what Velasco does is really talking about a different kind of vision of the land, and how he uses this landscape to really think about place and magnificent landscape as part of nation as well. Both are part of nation, but they're describing it in a different way. The final piece I want to talk about actually came to me in an email from academia.edu, which you all know about. And I was really struck that John Elkins an art historian, announced that between now and 2016, I will be moving out of art history, art theory, visual studies, and art criticism. We're done here. And into experimental writing. And he writes, art history, visual studies, and related fields have virtually no discourse on what might make writing interesting or challenging. We mainly just praise writers who are clear and remark on those who aren't. Meanwhile, just outside our disciplines, in literature, history, criticism, there's a rich literature on writing with complex history and an enormous repertoire of strategies for reading text. Within art history, it is as if none of these ever happened. His goal in taking this time off from writing art historical perspectives is that he wants to find different ways that images can work in relationship to text, from merely illustrating what's written, art history, to guiding the writing in visual studies, to working in unpredictable dialogue with the images. The final question for my roundtable discussion or images is how does our writing collaborate with the complexity of the systems of visual culture and its circulation? Thank you.